Previously on Learn All the Nodes.
Our last episode left us hanging a bit. We were able to do some basic Vue template work, but we had no way to do things like iteration and more advanced code reuse. Wouldn't it be nice to display a collection of things to our users? It sure would, and we get into that and more in this week's episode. First, we look at a shorthand for nesting tags. Instead of indenting, if the only content inside one tag is another tag, then we can just use a colon. This is a style choice that you'll get to make for yourself, and once you've done that, be sure to go on Twitter and tell everyone who disagrees with you that they're wrong. I favor the indent, so I'm going to leave it like it was. HTML5 style data attributes can come in real handy, and Jade supports them. It's rather predictable how it's done. You just put data-foo or data-format, whatever you want to call it. You write it just like you would if you were writing raw HTML. Then we can go to the browser and reload the page where we see our fancy data attributes. If you poked around on the Jade website, you might have come across includes. Include is a different word because it does something different than what block does. If you remember, when we extend a file that includes a block, it sort of sets up a placeholder saying that the extending file will supply that content. In contrast, when you lay down an include, it goes and fetches the file immediately and includes the content. This is analogous to includes in C++ or require in Ruby. And we can see how this works for a navbar in our code. Having previously written navbar.jade in our layouts folder, we can just include it in our home layout. Then we can see it in the browser. And do note that like extends, include calls take relative paths, so home.jade and navbar.jade are in the same directory. But the excitement continues. It turns out that we can have more than one block in our Vue template as well. Suppose that we were to the point in our project where we were including JavaScript files to run on the browser. There's likely some set of them that we would include on every single page, and that set might have jQuery in it and look like what you see before you. Well, we might have another page that needs some beefy JavaScript file in it, but we don't want to force a download of that on every page. One way to solve that is with an additional block. We can put the include for that additional file inside of the block, and then it only gets rendered when we need it. Of course, we'll need to make that file first. And then we can see it in all of its glory in the browser. There's our little alert. Thus far, our blocks have not included any content in the place where they're actually laid down, but that doesn't have to be the case. Back to our previous example of laying down some extra JavaScript, we could just name a block extra.js in the layout and embed our jQuery include beneath it. Then we can just add to that block. We do that with block append extra.js in our Vue, or more succinctly, append extra.js. This will put our additional content at the end of that block, which you may have guessed from the keyword append. And then we can look at it in the browser and see that there isn't any change. Now compare this to prepend, which will put the additional content at the beginning. Last time we looked briefly at how to pass variables to views, and we did that with our quote-unquote current user. We might also use this to restore our dynamic title like what you're seeing right now. What this also shows us is that when we extend a file, that file that we're extending also has access to the variables that we pass. Well, what about passing functions? You can do that as well. Here's Bossify, which looks even sweeter in the browser than it did in the code. Supposing that we wanted to use Bossify in more than just that one route, wouldn't it get tedious putting it everywhere like we're doing right now? It sure would, and we are going to fix that. First thing that we need to do is pull Bossify out into a separate module. Nothing magic here, we're just making a directory called apputils, and then we're going to put Bossify in its own file in there. To make a value available to all of our views by default, we need to make a configuration change. We use the locals function of our express instance and pass it an object whose properties we want access to in our views. This works just like the object we pass to our render call. But what if there's a collision? Well, if your render call uses a property with the same name as what you set here, the render call is going to win. I don't know why you do that, but hey, whatever floats your boat. Of course, we should probably also define app.util, which is analogous to app.route, which we've seen before. Perhaps we have a bestiary for our game, and here it is all wired up. We have an array of beasts simulating and retrieving them from the database, and we want to display these on the page. We have our array named beasts, and we pass it into our view via beasts. So we can put down an if statement. If we have some beasts, we'll show them to the user. And if we don't have some beasts, we'll give them a message saying that we don't have any. The way it's coded right now, we do have some, so let's see what that looks like in the browser. So we can cheat and make it look like we don't have any beasts, just to prove to ourselves that Jade is in fact taking the else path in this case. We're going to assume that we'll always have beasts in our bestiary, and so we'll just put the table down without the conditional check. To iterate, we use the each keyword and give it a variable name for what we want to call the item we get in each iteration, and we say that thing in the array we're iterating over. Then we give it a block of Jade, which gets repeated each time through our array. And within each iteration, beast is set to the current member of beasts. After restarting our server to account for our typo, we can then see the table appear in the browser. Now Jade would allow us to pull out the dash if we wanted to, which we can see when we reload the browser, but I prefer to leave the dash because I like to have my JavaScript lines visually distinct from my markup lines. I'll see you on Twitter. Speaking of dashes, if I wanted to just execute some JavaScript in a view, I can use a dash, as I'm demonstrating here with this console.log statement. You could even set up a for loop that way if you wanted to. You would just need to make sure that your closing curly brace is on a line with its own dash. Now this gives us a great opportunity to modularize our code even more. It's true that the iteration does save us some extra typing, but laying out that table interferes with the flow of the document. Mixins are a way to get little reusable functions of code, and you define a mixin just by typing mixin and then an identifier, and then you nest in under it the code that you want to use. And then to actually use it elsewhere in your document, you just do a plus sign and then the name of that identifier. And then we can see that in the browser too. Well, if we're going to make this mixin, we should probably have it show us the table. So we need to add a parameter to our mixin. We'll call it beast for simplicity's sake. Then we just pull out our row, drop that as the content of our mixin, and then we just need to call the mixin inside of our iteration loop instead of where we were before. And then of course we can see that in the browser. Last time we showed how to set a class and an ID on an element when we knew what they were supposed to be beforehand. What if they're supposed to be dynamic? Well, Jade has that covered too. When you're specifying attributes, you absolutely can include dynamic values. And despite their shortcuts, ID and class are just attributes on an element like any other. So to actually do that, we just use the string interpolation that we've seen before with the pound sign, and then we give the JavaScript expression to evaluate. And then we can go ahead and reload this in the browser, where we'll see that our pseudo database IDs that we added get added to the rows. There's one last thing we're going to look at. You can embed other languages into your Jade files. This is what Jade calls filters. For example, maybe you want to include a message from Borgeroth, and Borgeroth is of course going to use Markdown because that's what Borgeroth knows. So you get that all in there. Now we do need to make a tweak to our package file to include a module that can actually translate Markdown for us, and of course npm install that and restart the server, and then when we reload the page, we can see the message there for us. Oh, but there is a gotcha. There's always a gotcha. You can't do dynamic content in the filter. What you're seeing right now won't work. In fact, if it did work, it would throw an error because beasts is not defined for this route. When we reload this in the browser, we see that Borgeroth needs to work on ye old markdowneth skills. If you wanted dynamic markdown, you'd need a JavaScript function that renders markdown, and then you'll need to make that function available in your view using the methods we talked about earlier. Now this view template you're looking at right now is from the code that powers this very website that you're looking at. I enter in all the episodes in Markdown and then render their descriptions in that very manner. Alright then, that's a wrap for this week. You've now seen enough Jade to get cruising on your own projects. If you have any questions or comments, fire them off in the comment section below. You can also do further reading about Jade at the Jade website if you so desire. Next week we're going to stop being posers and actually use a database. It's going to be MongoDB, and we're going to interact with it via Mongoose. Until that time, go fight a beast sub-zero.name and happy coding. If you've been watching the episodes and want to add any comments or questions about them, don't forget that each episode has a comments tab where you can say something. And also, the site has a feedback where you can find contact information. So if you think I'm talking too much, or maybe there are just some other topics that you want to see covered, let me know. Thanks for watching.